I first visited the temple in 1984, and I was going there to look at what might or might not be portraits on there, on the central structure. Someone had, T.G. Aravamudan had said that these are portraits. There are some portraits there, and my dissertation was on portraiture. So I went there thinking, oh, I'll just take a couple of pictures and I'll be done here in half an hour. And the poor bicycle rickshaw, told him to wait. And then I walked in the space and I realized, oh, I have to take pictures of this. Now I have to take pictures of this. 3 hours later, he had long ago given up on me and biked back to town. And I was still taking pictures. There's just so much there. And I felt like this was something I couldn't even begin to wrap my mind around at that point. So I did other projects, but it sort of stayed there in the back of my mind. Someday I have to do this. And then I had some very helpful conversations with a colleague, Dennis Hudson, who taught at Smith College. And Dennis knew this monument so well, and he knew the Vaikuntha Perumal so well, and he had started to see connections between the two monuments. And so I worked with Dennis for quite a while about it. We gave some joint papers, and we discussed it over dinners and that sort of thing. So I've been trying to do it justice, but every time I think I'm done and I'm ready to, this is what it means, then more dimensions keep opening up, and I realize that it just has more to tell me, and I have to just look. And I'm sure that others, I was working there most recently in August with a team from the École Française in Pondicherry. Wonderful scholars, Charlotte Schmidt and Emmanuel Francis and Valérie Gillet. And then the whole other group, a whole workshop of people came with us. We were just wandering around the monument, and Emmanuel was actually reading the inscription that's wrapping around the Vimana. And then I would point out how the text and the images above it were in a kind of very elegant dialogue with each other. And so it felt like, yet again, more dimensions of this monument were opening up. So I haven't written the book yet, but now I feel like I'm starting to wrap my mind around its multiplicity being fundamental to what it means. And I guess I've been there 8, 9 times now, and I'll need to go again. This is one of the first, if not the first, temples that the Pallavas build out of separate pieces of stone. That is quarried stone that is transported to a site and then assembled, carefully cut so that the stones rest upon each other. That sort of construction begins, it seems, with this king Rajasimha, whose reign begins at the very end of the 7th century or beginning of the 8th century, right around 700. And then before that, before his reign, temples are much more sculptural. That is, they are sculptures of buildings. They are, in their earliest form, they are caves hollowed out of freestanding cliffs, mountains, boulders. And then the second stage is to hollow something out of that freestanding boulder, and then to finish the outside of the freestanding boulder in the shape of a temple. So the 5 ratas are the best example of that. Although there are other such buildings scattered all over Mahabalipuram and really all across northern Tamil Nadu. The École team have been finding these scattered throughout almost every village where they look. So you have rock-cut caves, then you have sculptures of temples, but the whole building is a single piece of living rock. And then you have the Kailasanatha, or Rajasimheshwara Temple, which is a bunch of separate stones put together. Hindu temples, in my understanding, are always locating the divine inside a cave, inside a mountain. And when you have And sometimes you have naturally occurring caves inside mountains, and that's like a Svayambhulinga. That's the divine manifesting in a natural form. But if you have a mountain and no cave, then you make the cave. You make a rock-cut cave. And then you can also turn the outside. If the outside doesn't look enough like a mountain, you can carve out the inside and then make the outside look more mountain-like, as you do at the Five Rathas. And if you don't have a cave or a mountain, then you just have to start from scratch. And you have to bring in a bunch of stones and make the mountain and carve the outside into what looks like a mountain. And then you make the cave inside. So it's always the cave inside the mountain. You just use the materials you happen to have. And so that, I think, weaves these Pallava monuments together, and it shows us this monument shows us the beginning of that last phase of constructed architecture. It is also, I should say, the grandest of all of the Pallava temples. The largest and the one that bears the widest variety of sculptural images. Other temples that Rajasimha and perhaps his followers construct all repeat some of the sculptures that we see at the Kailasanatha, but none of them repeats all of them. So they're all smaller refractions of the Kailasanatha, as it were. Valerie Gillet has done some wonderful work about trying to figure out geographic patterns among those smaller temples, the ones that are within Kanchipuram itself. And it sort of suggests that they are emanations of that, in pairs, emanations moving outward through Kanchi from that Kailasanatha temple. And then we have distant emanations. We have the shore temples at Mahabalipuram. Those are also built by Rajasimha. And we have another temple in Pannamalai inland, and that is also built by Rajasimha. Those have inscriptions on them that make it quite clear. So these expand outward, but I see Kanchipuram and this Kailasanatha temple as the geographic center of Rajasimha's presence. And probably this monument, the Kailasanatha complex, is the royal temple. I think this may have been close to the palace. It's got inscriptions of his son and at least one of the queens from the Pallava family. Maybe the queen mother, maybe a wife. They may be the same person, they may be different people. So you've got the family. This is a family project. And it's such a deluxe monument that it seems to me like it's their special, their Ishta Kovil or something, their favorite one. Valerie Gillet. She's just published a wonderful book about narrative at all of the Pallava temples. She spends a lot of it on the Kailasanatha temple, and she does a very ambitious survey of all kinds of textual, manuscript, narrative traditions that might have been running parallel to these sculpted ones, and potential connections between them and also divergences between them. So that work has been beautifully done, I think, already. And she demonstrates that there are many ways in which text and images are in conversation with each other, but that there are a number of ways in which texts don't explain the visual.
Yes.
And in fact, there are ways in which the visual can fill in gaps that the texts are leaving. My contribution can be to read the visual material more carefully after I respectfully study all of the textual material that my colleagues have collected, and you know, I've read some of that myself.
Right.
This so-called Pallava Chola transition. I had no confidence in it until I read Valerie Gillet's book. And I think she makes a very nice, she finds some very nice threads between the later Pallava temples and what we have called the early Chola temples. There, for example, the walking figure of Shiva Bhikshatana on Pallava period monuments, we see him, as I showed you, in profile. And by the time we get to the 10th century, and we're further south in the Kaveri region, Bhikshatana has turned out to walk towards us, so that we become the smitten women. And he's rotated out, his nakedness is apparent, and he's walking to us. And she has actually tracked that shift in these 8th century, late 8th century, maybe early 9th century monuments in Kanchipuram. So that's a breakthrough, I think, and makes me much more likely to see a kind of a thread connecting those late Pallava and early Chola period monuments. But I do not think that those connections are made by kings. The monuments that are these later Pallava period monuments are emerging as the Pallavas are getting weaker and weaker and may not be built by kings anymore. And I've already spilt a bit of ink arguing that the so-called early Chola temples are not built by the Cholas themselves. They're built before the Chola kings are interested in doing that, perhaps before they have the resources to do it. And those beautiful small stone granite Shiva temples, for the most part, that line the two sides of the Kaveri River and are built from say 875 until 975. Those are mostly, if they have inscriptions on them that tell us who built them, they tell us that somebody other than the Chola kings did the building. And their dispersal, their wide geographic dispersal and their small scale, and their stylistic irregularities suggest strongly to me that they are patronized by dispersed groups scattered throughout the natural wealth of the Kaveri Delta. So that wealth is at this point not yet the wealth of the Kaveri Delta hasn't yet been collected into within the control of a single family. Many families, and in some cases regional corporations, have enough funds to put together to turn the local temple from brick into stone. The temples were there before, but they become granite in the late 9th and 10th centuries. So if there's any continuity between the Pallavas and the Cholas, I would locate it in the artist workshops, not in the patrons. Some of the patrons who do leave inscriptions for us on these small 10th century monuments in the Kaveri region are women who marry into the Chola family. But they're the women. And the women are coming from these other locally prominent families, like the Irukuvel and the Mutta Iyer, and these other sort of small kings who precede the Cholas in this region. And I've suggested that these women are bringing that temple building practice with them from their natal families. And the Cholas are the Chola kings are sort of not into it yet. They're waiting. They don't get into it until Rajasimha. And maybe Rajasimha's uncle who precedes him on the throne, Uttama Chola. But it's in the end of the 10th century, starting in 971, that Uttama Chola's widow, Shambhian Mahadevi, begins to build temples. So she's one of these women who's coming from another family to the north. I think she may bring with her this practice of building temples and in the family name. And she starts building and building. She builds dozens. She builds So in some cases she's adding on this or that, but she builds more than a dozen temples from scratch. She inscribes them, and she changes the program of the decoration. She adds more figures to the exterior walls of the temple. They've previously been about 5, sometimes 3, sometimes 7, sometimes weird numbers like 6. But then with her, they become 9. And that means she's introducing new figures onto the temple walls to fill up these 9 niches. And one of those is Nataraja, which she seems to have a strong relationship with, a strong connection to. So in the last quarter of the 10th century, we start to see what I would consider Chola architecture. And it begins with her, with Shamin Mahadevi. The article in which I've made this argument is called A Man's World, ? So when Rajaraja is the first Pallava king, the first Chola king to pour large amounts of resources into building temples. And his Brihadeshwara temple is my evidence of that. He's changing the pattern in order to do this. And he's perhaps looking at his wise auntie and following in her footsteps. But she has sprinkled small temples across the delta. He pulls all the resources together into one enormous monument. And he takes the same architectural and sculptural patterns that we see on those small temples, and he multiplies each of them in scale and in number. So we see the same basic molding forms, the same construction of shapes around the figural niches. We see many of the same figural subjects, but everything is much bigger, and instead of 9 niches, we now have dozens of niches, and we have them in 2 stories. And the superstructure is the same basic vocabulary, the same basic Dravida vocabulary of huta, hut shapes, and shala, elongated shapes, alternating in clear mathematical relationships to each other, stacking up. But now it's many layers, whereas previously we've had rarely 4. 4 at the most, usually more like 2 or 3. So what he does grows very organically out of what's been happening before. But his moment is making it a Chola royal male thing. And when he does that, the scale changes. And that is followed by his son, who does the same thing at Gangaikonda Cholapuram.